Hello, my name's Molly Carlile. I'm the Consortium Manager for the North and West Metropolitan Region Palliative Care Consortium. I'm here today to speak to you about how we communicate with families in an environment where they're trying to come to terms with the imminent death of somebody that they love, and whether this takes place in a community setting or in an acute setting or in residential aged care. The sorts of things we need to be aware of are common across all of those settings. For those of you who've watched the program on diagnosing death that David Brumley did, you'll be aware that he identified the fact that as a society we tend to think of death as being a taboo subject, and therefore we don't talk about it very much. David also identified the fact that as health professionals, often our focus is very much on curing people, and that for some of us, when cure is not possible anymore, the fact that someone is going to die in the near or distant future is a bit threatening for us. It makes us feel uncomfortable because we haven't been able to cure them, and the focus of our work shifts from cure to care. And that requires a change in us. And David made that very plain in his presentation. So I'd like to pick up on that concept and ask the question, why is it that providing holistic care for dying people can be confronting for us as health professionals? Well, firstly, we're working with a unique person, and every patient's different, because their life experiences are different, their experience with their illness is different, their family and support structures are different. Some patients may approach things in a way that we find quite unusual, or in a way that may tempt us to think is dysfunctional. We're also working in environments where there's a highly charged level of emotion on a constant basis. So we're always working within environments where there are exaggerated emotions, anger, sadness, fear, anxiety. And this isn't just on behalf of the patients, it's on behalf of the families and the significant others who surround the patient. In addition to this, we're just one member of a team, and so we're having to negotiate with others in our team around care planning and how we approach patients and families. And finally, working with dying people and their families means that we have to confront our own fears about death. We have to think about our own mortality and have an idea about our own legacy and the things that are important to us in order to be able to appropriately work with patients and families. So what are the changes required within us as health professionals? I'd like to suggest that for a starter we need to think about what our own views are about death and mortality. We need to be constantly observing what's going on in the family dynamic. How many times have you seen families walk down the hall in your service towards the room of a patient who you know is imminently dying? And how many times have you been reluctant to approach them and pull them aside and say, hey, look, Mum's not doing too well today. How about we sit down and have a chat about that? We tend to avoid those conversations because they make us feel uncomfortable. And they make us feel uncomfortable because we haven't confronted our own mortality. So we need to engage with families. We need to build up a relationship of trust, because unless they trust us, they're not going to ask questions that they may think are embarrassing or are naive or that they're struggling with. They have to trust us for that to happen. And so we need to take the driver's spot here. We need to be informing families about what things are likely to happen in the next day, in the next weeks, in the next months, so that families are well prepared. And we need to invest in ourselves and take care of ourselves so we can be a resource to families. So we know the signs of when a patient is actively dying. We know how their body systems shut down. We know how they get decreased in appetite, decreased thirst. We know how progressively their renal function reduces, their circulation reduces. We know how they become increasingly bedbound. We know how they progressively detach from their physical environment that surrounds them. We know how they sort of withdraw within themselves. And we know the sign of when death is imminent. We know what that looks like. We know that patients' renal function can totally stop. We know that they may become sweaty and clammy to touch, that their skin may take a waxy sort of appearance or become mottled. We know that their extremities get cold to touch. We know that they're unconscious more than they're conscious. We know that they can become extremely disorientated and restless, and that when they start to alter their breathing pattern and move into Cheyne-Stokes breathing, that death is imminent. But I would suggest that often when families go to visit, we don't warn them about what they're going to see in the room. We've observed the deterioration in the patient, but sometimes we forget to tell the families about that. Often we don't tell them about what they're likely to see when they go into the room, what they're likely to hear, and things like patients with Cheyne-Stokes breathing or with gurgly respirations can be incredibly intimidating for families because they think it's hurting the patient. And unless we inform them about what that means and about what we're doing to manage it, then the families will get more and more anxious, more and more fearful. So we need to start planning how we explain the deterioration of patients before the deterioration starts to happen. The better families are prepared, the more they can focus on the person who's dying, the person that they love, instead of being bound up in the dying part. And my view is that we really need to be allowing them that permission by informing them, supporting them, and answering their questions in a timely fashion, so that that time that they spend is with the person that they love. I like to liken this to if you have to navigate a dark room that's full of furniture and get from one side of the room to the other. Chances are, if you're doing it in the dark, you're going to bump into furniture all over the place. And of course, you could injure yourself. So anyone who's sensible will switch on the light so that they can see the furniture around the room and so that they can navigate that furniture and get safely to the other side. And this is the picture I'd like you to remember when you're working with families. That's what we're there to do, to turn the light on for them so that they can see where the furniture is and navigate from one side of the room to the other, so that they can use that space to be with the person that they love and not be fearful and worried about what the dying part looks like. So how do we do this better? Of course, how we communicate is essential to how well we prepare families. We need to be constantly vigilant of the verbal and non-verbal messages we send to families. We need to be certain that we're telling them the truth. We're telling them things in a timely fashion, no matter how uncomfortable that may make us feel. We need to be conscious about the fact that if we avoid the issue, we make it 10 times worse for them, because then they imagine other outcomes. Then they may imagine goals that are unrealistic for the person that they love. So how we communicate is essential. The second thing is we need to really hone in on how we empathise with families. And by empathising, I mean stepping into their shoes for a little bit, feeling what it's like to be there, and then stepping out better informed and able to work with the family. Understanding what the issues are for them and working from a place of compassion, working from here instead of always from here. We need to allow time to just be with families. We tend to fall into the trap often of only going into a patient's room when there are things that need doing, tasks that need doing, because we can put all our focus in the task. And I'd suggest to you that families would get a whole lot more benefit from us if we just spent time in the room instead of only going in there when the IV needs changing, or the syringe driver needs changing, or the patient needs turning. Just going in and standing and being with the family so that they have the opportunity to ask questions if they want to. We need to understand that the better families are prepared, the less likely they are to have complex bereavement responses. We can't stop the fact that the person that they love is going to die, but we can make that dying process less stressful, less fearful, and less confronting for all involved by preparing people well. And we need to acknowledge that we have our own professional intuition. So if we get a feeling that something's not quite right, include the family in that conversation. If for some reason you think that the patient's going to die sooner than others had thought, even though that patient may be sitting up in bed eating a roast dinner, don't ignore that. That intuition is based on years of your professional experience. So act on it. Ring the family and say, look, I can't tell you why, but I've got a strange feeling about Mum, and if you want to spend some time with her, it might be a good idea to come in and visit now. So, in order to wind this up and leave you with some things to think about, I want you to remember, and this is basic stuff, but sometimes we forget. Each person we deal with is unique. And we constantly remind ourselves about that in relation to patients. But sometimes we forget to remind ourselves about that in relation to families. So each family member we spend time with is going to be different from the next. Each family member will respond in a different way. And we need to acknowledge that and empathise with those people. Each person is going to experience the death and their own personal grief differently. Death always happens before we expect it to. Even when someone's been sick for a long time, when they finally die, families will always say, I didn't think it was going to happen today. So our job is to have families as prepared as we can have them for the likelihood of it happening before they think it will. We need to acknowledge and act on our professional intuition. We need to appropriately look after ourselves and invest in ourselves, explore our own fears and anxieties, and invest in our own self-care. And we need to think about the needs of children in this whole scenario. And I'll talk to you about that a little more in the next session.